times, you brought that up earlier, a lot of times even our own ethnic groups will allow ourselves to have certain stereotypes about ourselves or to allow ourselves to use certain words in our context, but then if other people use it, we get highly offended by it. And I don't think that that's anything just in the African-American community. Like, a lot of times white citizens will get upset because they'll hear, you just mentioned the N-word, they'll hear the N-word mentioned or the B-word mentioned in rap videos, and then, when they use the word, then people in our community are looking at them all cross-eyed because it doesn't have the same context, but coming from that society. But a lot of times they don't understand that, and you can even say the same thing with other stereotypical words. I know some folks of mine that are Latin American or Hispanic citizens, and they will, they'll use derogatory terms, like I believe one of them is the word taco to basically their version of an Uncle Tom, and the same with apple for the Native Americans. But, if they use those terms, it's all right in those contexts, but, somebody else says that, like an African American says that to a Mexican person, it might be a fight on their hands.
Right. And internalized oppression is one way to think about that, or racialism, that somehow if we internalize the negative and hostility and dehumanization that other people have used against us, against our own people, we're thinking not only is that a problem from the standpoint of, treating other people or carrying on an enslavement sort of mentality, there's also the reality of, recent research has pointed out the importance of the health effects around internalized oppression. So, there's more research now that demonstrates that, for example, for black men, we know that if you've experienced racism, it affects how long you live on the planet. When they look at sort of different DNA evidence. But black men who actually experience racism and also have hostility and hatred towards other black people, they live even less longer. And the argument in that work is that just because you look at other people who like you and see them as less important doesn't mean you're not also directing that hostility towards yourself. You can't just sort of dismiss yourself from a group when your hatred is directed towards a smaller portion of that group. And I think that's a very interesting notion about, what it means to swallow the Kool-Aid of racial inferiority.
And that's another thing I was wondering what your thoughts on this topic were, because one of the people that I've heard people talk about in different contexts, and it comes up a lot of times, definitely when sometimes you talk to your white peers and things of that nature, is this whole concept of can an African American or any minority actually truly be racist or biased? Because, there are some that will argue that that's almost impossible because of the nature of the fact that we've been the victims of bias for so long that it's not even possible for us to be racist or to have these kind of biases. But it seems to me that that's a faulty notion. But I have heard that argument given that an African American male or an African American in general cannot be racist because the racism system was not created by them, so therefore they cannot be racist, or something along those lines.
Oh, were you talking to me? Or
yeah, talking to you. I was talking to you. I was just wondering what's your what from the psychology standpoint, what your view of that kind of attitude was, and how you cope with those people that would try to give those arguments.
I'm not a fan of that view, and I remember it because we used to think of systemic racism, and if black people do not have positions of power, how could if systemic racism is about power, do black people have the capacity if they're not at the highest rung of the system? And I don't agree with that. I think, the issues of how people, if you think about systemic racism, you need people who commit acts, heinous acts of dehumanization, but you also need people to not do things and not respond. And so that ability of acts of omission as well as commission are just as important. to keeping systemic racism alive. And the question is, are there people, in many respects, we could say, those contributors to systems are still carrying on racism. And so in that sense, I think just looking at systemic racism alone, that's one reason. But there's other ways to keep people out that are not just systemic, that are also spiritual and emotional. And I think that internalized oppression would be an example of, that problem.
And that's one of the things I was really fascinated about some of your research and everything, is that you've actually gone into institutions that by themselves have even had problems of being racism or being kind of like pockets of the communities that may not have that much exclusion within their nature of the way that they are structured. Like if you go to most churches in the African American community, most of them are predominantly African American. They may have other members, but the predominantly the membership is African American. The same with the European churches. The majority of those are European members, and even the barbershops. Most barbershops, they may have a couple of barbershops that are integrated, but most barbershops are really in the community that they are created at. And even some of your research has done projects to try to get, because these are oftentimes places where a lot of these kind of discussions take place at, whether it's the church or whether it's the barbershop. So I have noticed that you even have programs like Shape Up, where you're actually getting people like the barbers engaged in these kind of conversations. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit about how that program came about and what its success has been.
Sure. Doctors Loretta Jamott and John Jamott, who are colleagues of mine at the University of Pennsylvania and Drexel, we all together decided collectively to look at the power of barbershops. And as you know, that black barbershops in particular have been significantly powerful in times of stress for the black community, including civil rights, being a sort of storehouse of places you could trust to politically get at issues of difference, and also support black people causes. And that's true for beauty salons as well. But what is it about a black barbershop that could be potentially healing is the question. And the cultural affirmation of the barbershop, the historical significance, the ways in which you can share. What we learned is, as you know, black men will share a lot at a barbershop. They will not share to a pastor or a partner. They'll disclose very personal information in a haircut appointment. And by using it as a site of health, we were able to get men to not only learn new information. We taught the barbers to deliver the information in the cultural styles that they are used to, and that they use often to keep patrons happy.
Right.
So, what we've learned in the course of that, it took us, 5 years, but we were targeting not only retaliation violence, but sexual health risks. So the barbers were trained to teach black men between the ages of 18 and 24 how to reduce their risk around retaliation violence and engaging in safe sex. And not only was the work successful, we found that, after the intervention was done, and the barbers are some of the best counselors that we could find, and once they integrated their style, they were able to teach the men how to not only use the skills, but we found that we looked at violence rates, and that's fighting with a partner or with a loved one, that at the end of 3 months after the intervention, we found that being a part of our intervention significantly reduced fighting behavior. So the research on this is that when you use barbershops, it's very beneficial, not only in reducing fighting behavior because of our work, but how to take better care of your health. If you look at other folks' work, how do you take care of blood pressure? How do you learn what it means to be engaged around prostate cancer? And so using a trusted cultural affirmation context like the barbershop means you also have a chance to improve the health of men, who many people are afraid to even, talk up to about their health, let alone see them as caring.
And I've never quite understood that. I mean, I'm probably guilty of it. In fact, I know I'm guilty of it to some degree, just as much as anybody else. But it seems that we have a fear of a lot of things that we shouldn't have a fear of, like the medical doctors and the needing to have regular checkups and things of that nature, having our prostate checked on, and definitely having the various other things that are on a regular risk in our community on a regular basis. But for whatever reasons, and I don't know what it is psychologically, but it seems like a lot of us have a fear of doctors in general, but particularly medical doctors. And we also, a lot of us also have a fear of not even wanting to cope with any kind of medical situation. So I was just wondering, how are you able to deal with folks and their fears of this angle, particularly being one that comes from the psychology background? Because that's definitely a group of people that a lot of times African-American males just seem to have a fear about, even though, you talk to just about anybody, they call some sort of therapy at some point or another in their life, but a lot of times we don't want to address that part of our lives.
Yeah. Well, I think a big part of it, as you say, is, the way we think about manhood in our culture in general. And I think one of those aspects of manhood is not appearing weak. And if you go to the doctor, you find something's wrong with you, you're challenging your sense of strength. And the one way that I think the barbershops get away from that is that we trust the men who are doing our hair.
Right.
And that means, and we trust to tell them very personal stories that we don't tell anybody else. Those are the ingredients you need for men to then look at their manhood very differently, right? Because if I can tell you something personal and you still don't disrespect me, then maybe you're somebody, when you give me advice, I'll listen to more so than the other people in my life who expect me to be strong, who expect me to have it together. And so part of it is challenging the manhood and what it means to be a man and how that influences our health choices. And the other is I got to find somebody who will still see me as a man and still challenge me about taking care of myself.
And I imagine that our change in societies has also impacted a lot of that, because I know a lot of our families we're being raised by single parents, oftentimes single mothers, and a lot of times teenage men and young adults in their 20s are being thrust into like that leadership role, almost that fatherhood role, way before their time. So it seems like that probably also impacted a lot of our society. You're around the Philadelphia area, and I know that's a very urban area, so there's probably tons of people that are, being raised by single parents or being raised by even non-parents, because both of the parents may be gone. So they may be being raised by their aunts or their grandparents or other folks, and then they wind up being forced into leadership roles that they were not prepared for. So they probably have to learn coping skills in order to deal with that as well.
And I think I think it doesn't matter, at least from our work, that we know a lot of the kids whose fathers aren't at home still have access to those fathers, or men who are willing to take on the role. And it's always tough when you don't have both parents around. But one of the challenges is financial, and the time it takes to spend to keep a house alive. And the gender of the parent isn't the issue, but the context in which we live in. And there are men who know, who have been raised in single-parented homes, who've learned a lot about manhood from mothers and their choices and who they decide should be a part of their family. So I do think the issue of leadership is important, because the one thing that the barbers were able to do in this example we're talking about is they were also teaching the men about what it means to be black and male and deal with racial literacy stuff. So the irony is that we found that the men who tended to not know